In the sterile quiet of a London boardroom, insurance investigator Kaelen Riley built his career on one simple truth. Every mystery has a logical explanation. But when 25 souls vanish from an unsinkable ship found drifting empty in the Pacific, logic itself begins to drown. The MV Joyita should have been impossible to abandon. So why did her crew choose the merciless ocean over the safety of their vessel? Some mysteries don't just challenge what we know, they shatter who we are. In the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of a London boardroom, Kaelen Riley was a surgeon, and his scalpel was logic. On the screen behind him, a slide showed a photograph of a scorched shipping container, its contents reduced to ash. "The claimant states the fire was accidental," Kyle said, his voice a flat, unemotional instrument. His eyes, weary from a career spent sifting through lies, scanned the faces of the insurance executives. They blame faulty wiring in the refrigeration unit. He clicked to the next slide, a chemical analysis report. However, our lab found traces of a commercial accelerant, specifically toluene, in the insulation. Furthermore, another click, a shipping manifest appeared. The container's stated contents, frozen Norwegian salmon, were never loaded onto the vessel in Rotterdam. The manifest was forged. He paused, letting the silence hang. This was not a disaster. It was arson, designed to defraud this company of £2 million. He closed his laptop. Case closed. For Kyle, every mystery was a locked room, and the key was always the same. Follow the data and follow the money. There were no ghosts, no curses, no inexplicable phenomena. There were only broken parts, flawed plans, and human greed. Back in his boss's office, a thick, water-stained file landed on the desk with a heavy thud. It looked ancient, out of place in the modern glass and steel building. On the cover, written in faded ink, were two words: MV Joyita. "I need you in the South Pacific," his boss, a man named Sterling, said, without preamble. "This one a ghost." Cal raised an eyebrow. "Ghosts don't file claims, Sterling." "This one did," Sterling retorted. "The vessel was found 5 weeks ago, adrift near Fiji. No crew, no passengers. 25 souls, vanished into thin air." He pushed the file toward Kyle. The ship was damaged, taking on water, but the salvage team says she was sound. Her designer built her with so much cork lining she was practically unsinkable. The life rafts are gone, but there is more, or rather, less. No distress calls, save for one garbled message that was cut short. No bodies, no wreckage. The ship was just empty. Sterling leaned forward. "It's a high-value policy, Kael. The owners are screaming. The families are pressuring politicians. We need this resolved. We need an explanation that holds up in court. An unsinkable ship found empty. A crew that vanished without a trace." For the first time in years, Kyle felt a flicker of something other than professional cynicism. It was the cold, clean thrill of an impossible problem. Weeks later, the thrill had been replaced by the oppressive, sweltering heat of Suva Harbor. The air was thick with the scent of salt, diesel, and rotting fruit. Kyle stood on a weathered dock, shielding his eyes against the blinding sun, and looked at the MV Joyita for the first time. The photographs in the file hadn't done it justice. It wasn't just a ship, it was a scar. A battered, rusting hulk, listing heavily to its port side, a gaping hole in its superstructure. It looked like a wounded animal that had dragged itself ashore only to die, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The vibrant postcard blue of the Pacific and the lush green of the hills beyond only made the vessel's dereliction more stark, more unsettling. It did not belong here. It felt wrong. In a small, sweltering office overlooking the harbour, Kyle met with the local harbour master, an old Fijian man named Manu, whose skin was a roadmap of his years at sea. His eyes were dark and knowing. Kyle, All business requested the initial salvage reports, the cargo manifests, the crew list. Manu slid a thin stack of papers across the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. "The papers will not tell you the story, Messy Tate," Manu said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. Kyle looked up from the documents. "They're a place to start," Kyle replied. "Facts, measurements, data." Manu smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "There is data, and there is truth. They are not always the same." He leaned forward, lowering his voice even further, though they were alone. "That ship is taboo. It is a forbidden place now. When the salvage crew first brought her in, my men would not go near her after dark. They heard things." "Heard what?" Kyle asked, his skepticism a shield. "The whispers of the Nitu," Manu said, the name spoken with a deep, ancestral reverence. "The sea demons. They hunger for souls lost in the deep. They do not sink a ship with waves. They sink the mind with fear. That is their trick. They took the souls from that boat one by one." He tapped the file with a crooked finger. "You will not find people in your reports, Investigator. You will only find their shadows." Kale gave a polite, non-committal nod. But inside, his resolve hardened. Shadows didn't have legal standing. Sea demons couldn't be subpoenaed. The truth was in the wreckage, in the rust, in the waterlogged wood. He would find it. The harbour master's talk of sea demons and curses was nothing more than a ghost story, a local fable to explain the unexplainable. Kaelen Riley dealt in facts. The next morning, under the relentless gaze of the Pacific sun, he stepped from the harbour launch onto the deck of the MV Joyita. The ship groaned under his weight, a low, mournful sound of stressed metal. He was no longer an observer. He was a participant in the ship's eerie silence. He'd put on a pair of disposable coveralls, his movements precise as he began his survey. His camera flashed, documenting every detail. His audio recorder captured his clipped professional observations. Main deck. Time is 09:14. Weather, clear. Evidence of storm damage to the superstructure. Port side railing is gone. But it was the small things that were the most unsettling. The scene was one of preserved chaos, as if the crew had simply evaporated mid-action. In the galley, a plate with a half-eaten meal of fish and rice sat on a table, a fork resting beside it. On the aft deck, a small, brightly coloured wooden bird, a child's toy, lay on its side near the railing. In the radio room, a calendar was still open to October, the month she had sailed into oblivion. Kyle documented it all, his face an impassive mask. Then he noted the first major contradiction. The davits for the ship's 4 life rafts were empty, the rafts were gone. But below deck, in the passenger cabins, suitcases and bags were still tucked under the bunks. Wallets, papers, and money had been left behind. People fleeing a sinking ship take their life rafts. They do not, however, leave their valuables. It was a clean, clear piece of evidence that made no logical sense. He moved deeper into the vessel, descending into the lower decks where the air was thick with the stench of stagnant seawater and decay. His flashlight cut a sharp beam through the oppressive darkness. The water was knee-deep, sloshing with every step. He made his way to the engine room, a cramped space of pipes and machinery now submerged in murky water. He swept his light across the silent engine block, and then he saw it. His beam landed on a section of lead pipe connected to the engine's cooling system, or rather, where it was supposed to be connected. A 2-foot section was completely gone, its ends ragged and green with corrosion. Kyle leaned in, his practiced eye immediately understanding the chain of events. A small leak, unnoticed for weeks, had been eating away at the pipe from the inside. At some point, the pressure had become too much. It would have burst, unleashing a torrent of seawater into the engine room. This was it, the inciting event, the first domino, the scientific, verifiable cause for the ship's distress. The ghost of the Nitu began to recede, replaced by the familiar, comforting certainty of mechanical failure. That night, in the sterile quiet of his hotel room, Kyle sat at a makeshift desk, the day's evidence laid out before him. The pieces fit together into a neat, tragic narrative. He spoke into his audio recorder, his voice confident as he dictated the preliminary findings for his report. Initial conclusion: the primary cause of the incident was the failure of a 1.5-inch lead pipe in the engine's raw water cooling circuit. This would have resulted in rapid flooding of the lower decks. With the engine room compromised and the electrical systems failing, the crew would have been adrift in total darkness. He paused, picturing the scene. Given the circumstances, it is my professional opinion that the captain, fearing the vessel was foundering, gave the order to abandon ship. The crew and passengers, in a state of panic, boarded the 4 life rafts and were subsequently lost to the vastness of the Pacific. A tragedy, yes, but a logical one. He clicked the recorder off. He felt the cold, clean satisfaction of a puzzle solved. It was a tidy explanation that would satisfy the underwriters. The case was all but closed. He allowed himself one final sweep of the ship the next day, a matter of professional pride. Due diligence. He moved through the water-damaged cabins one last time, his eyes scanning for anything he might have missed. In the captain's cabin, a small roll of oilskin, a waterproof pouch, had been tucked away inside a navigation chart locker, just above the waterline. His heart gave a slight, uncharacteristic leap. He carefully unrolled the pouch. Inside, miraculously preserved, was the ship's logbook. He carried it out onto the sunlit deck and began to read. The early entries were routine: weather reports, navigational fixes. Then, an entry for the day: the voyage went wrong. It calmly described the pipe failure and the beginning of the flooding, just as Kael had deduced. Engine room taking on water. Pumps are not holding. Have shut down the engine to slow the leak. Kael nodded to himself. It confirmed everything. He turned the page to the final entry. The handwriting was different. It was shaky, almost illegible, the desperate scrawl of a man at the end of his rope. Kyle leaned closer, deciphering the words that would shatter his tidy theory forever. Doctor's bag needed, it read. On deck, God help us. The last line of the logbook was a splinter in Kaelen Riley's mind. God help us. These were not the words of a captain calmly ordering an evacuation. They were a cry of desperation. The tidy narrative he had constructed in his hotel room, a simple case of mechanical failure and panicked flight, now felt like a flimsy fiction. The story of the Joyita was not over, it was just beginning. His first stop was a dusty, forgotten corner of the Suva government building, a radio archive filled with the ghosts of broadcasts past. He sought out the one piece of communication that had escaped the ship, the single, garbled distress call. An elderly archivist, after a long search, threaded a brittle magnetic tape onto a playback machine. It is not much, the archivist warned, pushing a button. The speakers crackled to life, hissing with oceanic static. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a man's voice, sharp with panic, broke through. Joyita to KCJV. Partial explosion in engine room. Captain Miller he is down. Repeat, Captain is... The voice was abruptly cut off, replaced by the unending hiss of the static. Kyle had the archivist play it again, and again. It wasn't an SOS. There was no position given, no request for aid. It was a raw, unfiltered shout of chaos into the void, and then silence. A major breach of maritime protocol. A ship in distress would broadcast continuously, unless the radio operator was pulled away from his post, or was no longer able to transmit. The simple story of a broken pipe was becoming a complex tale of escalating crisis. Armed with this new knowledge, an injured Captain Kyle returned to the Joyita. The logbook had said, on deck. He now had a grim purpose. He made his way to the aft deck, a wide, open space exposed to the elements. He began a meticulous grid search, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. Tucked away under a heavy, salt-stiffened canvas tarp, he found it. A dark leather doctor's bag, its contents spilled across the wooden planks. And blood, a significant amount of it, dark and rusted on the wood. He knelt, his professional detachment failing him for the first time. Scalpels and sutures lay scattered amongst several rolls of bandages, which were soaked through with dried blood. This wasn't first aid. This was a scene of frantic, desperate surgery, performed in the open air, on the deck of a dying ship. The visceral, undeniable evidence screamed a truth his tidy theory could not contain. This was not panic. This was a battle for life. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Pacific in hues of orange and purple, Kael sat on the deck of the ghost ship. He held a single bloody bandage in a clear evidence bag on his lap. The gentle lapping of the waves against the hull seemed to mock the violent scene he had just uncovered. His entire case had been turned on its head. He had been so sure, so confident in his logical chain of cause and effect. Broken pipe leads to flooding. Flooding leads to panic. Panic leads to abandonment. It was clean, but it was wrong. The crew didn't just panic and flee. They stayed. They fought. They tended to a grievous injury right here on this very deck. They were on this ship for hours, maybe even days after the initial incident, locked in a struggle for survival he couldn't begin to imagine. He stared out at the vast, empty ocean, and a chilling realization washed over him. He had been asking the wrong question all along. The mystery wasn't why they left the ship. It was what happened here, before they left. What horror had unfolded on these decks that made taking their chances in a life raft on the open Pacific the better option? That night, Kael sat in a noisy waterfront bar, the official reports and his own neat notes seeming utterly useless. He had no theory. The facts he had gathered only added up to an impossibility. He was nursing a drink when a familiar figure sat down opposite him. It was Manu, the old harbour master. "The shadows are deep on that boat Mesitate," Manu said quietly, as if continuing a conversation from weeks ago. Kael, frustrated and out of options, looked at the old man. "Tell me about the Nitu," he said, the words feeling foreign and foolish in his mouth. "The sea demons." Manu nodded slowly. "They are not creatures with teeth and claws. They are older than that. They are a sickness of the sea itself, a madness of the deep, my grandfather called it." He leaned in, his voice low. "When you are alone on the great ocean, in the dark, with no land in sight, the Nitu begin to whisper on the wind. They do not attack the ship's hull. They attack the men's minds. They whisper of fear, of suspicion, of betrayal. They turn brother against brother. They make a man see a monster in his friend's face." Manu finished his drink. "The Nitu do not need to sink a ship, Investigator. They convince the crew to do it for them." He stood up and left Kael alone at the table, the ghost story lingering in the air like smoke. Kael stared into his glass. A madness of the deep. It was superstition. It was folklore. But it was the first thing that had made any sense all day. The old harbour master's story lingered in Kael's mind long after he left the bar. It was folklore, a ghost story told to explain the terrors of the sea. But as a man who dealt in human nature as much as mechanical failure, Kael knew that what people believe can be as powerful as any physical force. He returned to his hotel room, no longer seeing it as a place to write a simple report, but as a space to solve a far deeper puzzle. He began to pin his evidence to the wall, creating a physical timeline of the disaster, a photo of the corroded pipe, a transcript of the single panicked radio call, a close-up of the shaky, desperate entry in the ship's log, a stark, brutal image of the blood-stained bandages on the deck. These were the facts, the science. Then he took a blank note card and, after a moment's hesitation, wrote 3 words on it: madness of the deep. He pinned it to the center of the board. He stared at the collection of evidence, no longer trying to force it into a linear chain of cause and effect, but looking for a different kind of pattern, a cascade. He imagined the darkness, the sound of flooding water, the loss of power. What would that do to the human mind? adrift and alone in the vast, empty Pacific. He began to see the superstition not as an alternative to the facts, but as a potential consequence of them. To test this new, unsettling theory, he needed to understand the people, not just the ship. The next day, he hired a boat to take him to a small, remote island village, the home of one of the missing crewmen, a deckhand named Samuela. Kyle found Samuela's wife weaving a mat in the shade of a palm tree. He didn't ask about the ship's seaworthiness or the cargo. He asked about the man. Samuela was a good man, she said, her voice soft with grief. A strong sailor, but his heart was full of shadows. She explained that he had been raised on stories of the Nitu, the sea demons. For him, they weren't just folklore. They were a real and present danger. He would have dark moods, she continued, her hands stilling. Times when he would not speak for days. He was terrified of being lost at sea, not of the storms, not of the waves. He was afraid of the silence, the darkness. He said, "That is when the whispers begin." Kyle thanked her, his mind reeling. He now had a crucial piece of the psychological puzzle. He had a patient zero for the madness of the deep. That night, Kael stood before his evidence board, and the final, horrifying picture clicked into place. He could see it all now, a cascade of failure, both mechanical and human. He traced the path with his finger. "It starts with the pipe," he whispered to the empty room. "The engine room floods, the lights go out, the ship is plunged into darkness and chaos." His finger moved to the next photo. The captain is on deck trying to restore order, but the ship lurches. He falls, a severe injury. The radio operator sends one panicked, incomplete message before he has to leave his post to help. He looked at the picture of the bloody bandages. They were adrift. No power, no lights, no leader. The doctor on board, a passenger, tries to perform a desperate surgery on the open deck to save the captain's life. He then pointed to the note card in the center of the board. And in that darkness, that terror, Samuela's deepest fears are realized. The Nitu are real to him. The wind howling through the damaged superstructure becomes the whispers of demons. The fear, his paranoia, it's a contagion. He tells the others the ship is cursed, that they are all doomed. His finger moved to a map of the ocean. A struggle breaks out. Paranoia turns to violence. Some try to restore order, others surrender to the madness. And in that final desperate moment, a small group, led by a terrified Samuela, decides that staying on the cursed ship is a fate worse than death. They launch the life rafts, taking the injured captain and anyone else they can, and flee into the storm. He stepped back from the board. The sea demons were not real, but the madness they represented, the terror, the paranoia, the violence born of desperation that was very real. He had found his answer. The next morning, Kyle stood on a deserted beach as the sun rose, painting the sky in soft pastels. He had solved the puzzle. He had a complete, cohesive theory that accounted for every piece of evidence. But there was no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only a profound and hollow sadness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, the one he had found snagged on a nail in the captain's cabin, the only truly personal effect left behind on the entire ship. He clicked it open. Inside was a faded, postage stamp-sized photo of a woman and a small child. He was no longer just an investigator closing a case file. He was now the sole keeper of this final tragic story. The world would get a report, an explanation filed away in a cabinet in London. But he alone would carry the weight of the 25 souls who had been consumed not by a monster from the deep, but by the demons within themselves. The truth, Kaelen Riley had discovered, was not a clean, straight line of cause and effect. It was a tangled, horrifying knot of mechanical failure, human fear, and desperate faith. Weeks of investigation had led him from a London boardroom to a derelict ghost ship, and finally to this sterile conference room in Suva. He stood before a panel of insurance executives and maritime authorities. the men who dealt in liability and regulations. They wanted a tidy explanation, a box to check, a file to close. Kyle knew he could not give them one. He began his presentation not with the broken pipe, but with a slide showing 25 black and white photographs, the faces of the crew and passengers of the MV Joyita. "Before we discuss the vessel," Kyle said, his voice quiet but firm, "we must first discuss the people." He went through them one by one, giving their names, their ages, their professions. Captain Thomas Miller, Dr. Alfred Parsons, Samuela, the deckhand, a family with 2 young children. He was not just listing a crew manifest. He was reintroducing the victims, turning them from statistics back into human beings. He was ensuring that before they judged the outcome, they understood the cost. Then, as the faces of the lost stared out at the silent room, Cal began to tell their story. His voice became a somber narration over a nightmare. "It began with a single point of failure," he said. The conference room faded away, replaced by the dark, cramped engine room of the Joyita. A lead pipe, green with corrosion, suddenly bursts, unleashing a high-pressure torrent of seawater. The lights flicker and die. The roar of the engine is replaced by the roar of the flood. On deck, chaos reigns in the sudden, absolute darkness. Captain Miller is shouting orders, trying to restore calm, when a heavy wave crashes over the side, sending a loose piece of cargo sliding across the deck. It strikes him down, a sickening crunch of bone. The ship's radio operator sends a single, panicked message before abandoning his post to help his fallen captain. They are adrift, powerless, and leaderless. Kyle's voice continued, low and steady. With the captain grievously injured, command broke down. Dr. Parsons, a passenger, did what he could. They brought the captain onto the aft deck, under a swinging lantern, and attempted a desperate, makeshift surgery. The scene shifts to the bloody tableau on the deck, the glint of a scalpel in the swaying lamplight, the grim faces of the crew holding the captain down, the fear in their eyes. But in the darkness, another, more insidious poison was leaking into their minds. It was fear. The deckhand, Samuela, a man raised on local legends, saw not a mechanical failure, but a curse. He saw the work of the Nitu. We see Samuela's terrified face, his eyes wide in the gloom. He begins to whisper to the other crew members. "The ship is taboo. The demons have taken the captain. They are all doomed." The whispers spread like a virus, infecting the others. Arguments break out. Paranoia turns to aggression. A struggle ensues. The desperate attempt to save a life descends into a fight for survival against imagined phantoms. A small group, convinced the ship itself was the monster, decided to flee, Kyle narrated. They launched the life rafts into the stormy sea, taking the dying captain and the other injured with them, abandoning a vessel that would not sink for an ocean that would not spare them. The final image of the life rafts disappearing into the stormy blackness faded, and the stark light of the conference room returned. The executives and officials sat in stunned silence, their faces pale. Kyle stood before them, his expression grim. "The MV Joyita did not sink," he concluded, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was designed to be unsinkable, but the crew was not. They were not taken by demons, but by a demon we all carry within us, the terror of the unknown. They abandoned a perfectly good ship and were lost to the sea. The final insurance liability rests on a single, corroded pipe. The human cost, however, is incalculable." Weeks later, the grey familiar chill of a London morning felt alien to Kael. He walked down a busy street, the sounds of traffic and commerce a world away from the silence of the Pacific. He looked different. The sharp, cynical edge in his eyes had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more somber. He passed a newsstand, and a headline caught his eye. "Joyita Ghost, Ship Mystery Closed. Official cause cited as mechanical failure." For the world, it was a solved file, a line item in a ledger, a closed case. For Kael, it was a ghost that would walk with him forever. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers closing around the small, tarnished silver locket he had found in the captain's cabin. It was warm from his touch. It was the only piece of the story he had kept, a final, tangible connection to the people the sea had taken, and the man he had been before he'd learned their names. The mystery of the MV Joyita isn't just that the ship was found empty. The truly haunting part is that the initial scientific explanation was found almost immediately. A broken pipe caused a flood. It's a clean, logical fact. But that simple fact, the what, couldn't explain the much deeper why. Why did 25 people vanish from a famously unsinkable ship? For the investigator Kaelen Riley, the answer only came when he stopped dismissing the local folklore about sea demons. He realized the superstition wasn't a competing theory to be debunked. It was a psychological map. The legend described a madness of the deep, a force that turns people against each other in the dark. The story's chilling conclusion is that the sea demons were real, just not in the way we might think. They weren't in the water. They were in the minds of the crew, born from the terror of isolation, the failure of technology, and the loss of a leader. The science explains how the ship broke, but the superstition is what helps us understand how the people did. It suggests that some truths can only be found where the engineering report and the ghost story meet. It makes you wonder about other legends of the sea. How many stories of mermaids, ghost ships, or krakens are not just myths, but are actually humanity's attempt to put a name to the very real psychological horrors that the vast, empty ocean can unleash?